Moving into a new neighborhood was supposed to be a fresh start for Clara and her husband, Daniel. The charming suburban street, lined with well-kept lawns and friendly neighbors, promised a tranquil life. After years of city noise and cramped apartments, they'd finally found a place to call their own. Their new home was everything they dreamed of, and the neighbors wasted no time welcoming them. The first evening, a knock at the door revealed Megan and her husband, James, bearing a bottle of wine and a plate of cookies. Megan was lively and warm, chatting animatedly about the community and offering tips about the best grocery stores and local restaurants. James, on the other hand, was quieter but equally friendly, his deep voice and easy smile putting Clara at ease. As they sat in the living room, sipping wine and swapping stories, Clara couldn't help but notice James. He was strikingly handsome, with dark hair, sharp features, and an athletic build that was hard to ignore. When he leaned forward to pour another glass, the fabric of his shirt pulled taut across his chest, hinting at the toned muscles beneath. Clara quickly looked away, chastising herself for the fleeting thought. Daniel was sitting right beside her, after all, laughing at one of Megan's jokes. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned more relaxed, aided by the wine. James eventually excused himself to adjust something in their backyard, and when he returned, he'd removed his shirt, citing the heat of the evening. The sight of his sculpted abs and broad shoulders caught Clara off guard. She felt a flush rise to her cheeks and tried to focus on Megan's story, but her gaze kept wandering back to him. When the neighbors finally left, Clara felt a mix of relief and guilt. She brushed off the evening's thoughts as harmless admiration, nothing more. But the image of James lingered in her mind, no matter how much she tried to push it away. In the days that followed, Clara settled into their new routine. Daniel went back to work, leaving Clara to unpack and organize the house. One morning, while she was watering the plants in the front yard, James jogged by, shirtless and glistening with sweat. He waved, flashing a smile. "Morning, Clara! Settling in okay?" he asked, pausing briefly. Clara nodded, trying to keep her composure. "Yes, everything's great. Thanks again for the other night." "Anytime," James replied, his tone warm. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." As he continued down the street, Clara's heart raced. She chided herself for the way her body reacted to him, determined to focus on her marriage and her new home. The turning point came a week later, during another neighborhood gathering. Megan had invited Clara and Daniel over for dinner, along with a few other neighbors. It was a lively evening filled with laughter, good food, and plenty of drinks. As the night wore on, Clara found herself seated next to James. Their conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from travel to their shared love of baking. "Megan's the baker in our house," James admitted with a grin. "I just handled the taste testing." Clara laughed. "Daniel's the same way. I swear he'd live on pies and cookies if he could." Their laughter felt natural, unforced. But beneath it was an undercurrent of something more, a charged energy that neither acknowledged but both felt. The next morning, Clara couldn't stop thinking about James. She told herself it was harmless, just a friendly connection. But when she spotted Megan leaving their house with a grocery bag in hand, an idea took root. Before she could talk herself out of it, Clara baked a fresh pie, wrapped it in foil, and walked over to James and Megan's house. James answered the door, his surprise quickly turning into a warm smile. "Clara, hey! What's this?" "Just a pie," Clara said, her voice slightly breathless. "I thought I'd bring it over since Megan mentioned she loved baked goods." James stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. "She's out running errands, but I'll make sure she gets it. Want to come in for a minute?" Clara hesitated but stepped inside. The house was cozy and inviting, and the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. James led her to the kitchen, where he set the pie on the counter. "Can I get you something to drink?" he asked. "Just water, thanks," Clara replied, suddenly hyper-aware of how close they were. James handed her a glass, his fingers brushing hers briefly. The contact sent a jolt through her, and when their eyes met, the charged energy from the dinner party returned, stronger than before. The tension broke when James leaned against the counter, his voice low. Clara, I hope I'm not reading this wrong, but there's something here, isn't there? Clara's heart pounded. She knew she should deny it, laugh it off, leave. But instead, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I think so. James closed the distance between them, his movements deliberate but hesitant. When he reached for her hand, Clara didn't pull away. Their lips met in a tentative kiss, quickly growing deeper as the weeks of unspoken attraction spilled over. In the heat of the moment, Clara forgot everything: her husband, Megan, the consequences. All that mattered was the electric connection between her and James. They moved to the living room, their kisses growing more fervent. Clothes were shed, barriers broken, and they gave in to the desire that had been simmering since that first night. As Clara dressed afterward, guilt began to creep in. James walked her to the door, his expression unreadable. This doesn't have to be a one-time thing, he said softly. Clara hesitated, torn between the rush of what had just happened and the weight of what it meant. She nodded quickly, slipping out the door and hurrying back to her house. As she stepped inside, the reality of her actions hit her like a wave. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the consequences were just beginning to unfold. Clara's guilt gnawed at her in the days following her tryst with James. She avoided his gaze when she passed him on the street, and busied herself with household chores to keep her mind occupied. But no matter how much she tried to bury her feelings, the memory of that afternoon lingered, electrifying and undeniable. It didn't help that James wasn't avoiding her. If anything, he seemed emboldened. A casual wave here, a lingering glance there, each interaction was a silent reminder of what they'd shared. Clara hated how her pulse quickened every time she saw him, how a part of her longed for the danger of being near him again. The breaking point came one afternoon when Megan dropped by unannounced. Clara opened the door to find her neighbor holding a plate of cookies and wearing her usual cheerful smile. I thought I'd bring these over, Megan said. Consider it payback for that amazing pie you made last week. Clara forced a smile, her stomach twisting with guilt. Thanks, Megan. That's so sweet of you. Megan stepped inside, her eyes scanning the living room. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. Not at all, Clara said quickly, gesturing for her to sit. Can I get you something to drink? As they chatted, Clara's mind raced. Did Megan suspect anything? Was her visit just a friendly gesture, or was there something more behind her easy demeanor? Every laugh and casual comment felt like a test, and by the time Megan left, Clara was emotionally drained. That evening, Clara found herself alone in the kitchen, staring at her phone. Her fingers hovered over James's number, debating whether to call him. She knew it was reckless, but the pull was too strong to resist. Hey, she typed, her heart pounding. Can we talk? His reply came almost instantly. Come over. Megan's out. Clara hesitated for only a moment before grabbing her coat. As she walked the short distance to James's house, her mind buzzed with anticipation and dread. When he opened the door, his expression was a mix of desire and amusement. I wasn't sure if you'd come, James said, stepping aside to let her in. I shouldn't be here, Clara said, her voice shaky. James reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. But you are. Their lips met in a heated kiss, and once again, Clara found herself swept away by the intensity of her feelings. They moved to the couch, their touches growing more urgent as they surrendered to the moment. But this time, guilt wasn't far behind, nagging at the edges of Clara's mind even as her body betrayed her. Afterward, Clara sat on the edge of the couch, pulling her clothes back on while James leaned back, watching her. You don't have to leave so soon, he said, a hint of disappointment in his voice. Clara shook her head. This was a mistake. We can't keep doing this. James sat up, his tone shifting to one of frustration. Then why did you come? You keep saying it's a mistake, but you keep coming back. She had no answer, only a knot of conflicting emotions tightening in her chest. Without another word, she grabbed her coat and left, the cold evening air doing little to calm her racing thoughts. Back at home, Clara tried to act normal, but Daniel noticed her distraction. "Everything okay?" he asked as they sat down for dinner. "Yeah," Clara replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired from unpacking." Daniel nodded, accepting her answer, but his concerned gaze lingered. Clara's stomach churned with guilt. She hated lying to him, hated what she was becoming. But the pull toward James was as intoxicating as it was destructive. The next day, Clara resolved to avoid James entirely. She ignored his texts, didn't glance at his house, and focused on keeping busy. But as the days stretched into weeks, her resolve weakened. The memory of his touch, his voice, haunted her. And James wasn't making it easy to forget. One afternoon, she found a note slipped under her door. "We need to talk. I can't stop thinking about you. James." Clara crumpled the note in her hand, anger and longing warring within her. She knew she was playing with fire, but the thrill was impossible to resist. The more she tried to distance herself, the more the tension between them grew, threatening to consume her entirely. Things came to a head during another neighborhood gathering. This time, Clara and Daniel hosted a barbecue in their backyard, inviting Megan, James, and a few other neighbors. Clara's heart raced as she saw James arrive with Megan, his gaze locking onto hers briefly before he turned his attention to the group. Throughout the evening, Clara felt his presence like a magnet, pulling her focus away from Daniel and the other guests. When their eyes met across the yard, the unspoken tension was palpable. Clara excused herself to the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe. To her dismay, James followed. "What are you doing?" Clara hissed, glancing toward the door to ensure no one saw them. James stepped closer, his voice low. "I can't stay away from you. And I don't think you want me to." Clara's heart pounded as he reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her voice trembling. "We can't do this here. Not now." James's gaze softened, but he didn't press further. "We need to talk. Soon." Clara nodded reluctantly, and James left the kitchen, leaving her to grapple with the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She knew their dangerous game couldn't continue forever, but she didn't know how to stop it without everything falling apart. Clara's resolve to distance herself from James was tested in ways she hadn't anticipated. Every glance, every accidental meeting on the street, felt like a temptation too great to resist. And James didn't make it easy. His casual waves and knowing smirks reminded her of their secret, igniting the desire she was struggling to suppress. One evening, Daniel suggested they invite Megan and James over for dinner. "It's been a while since we've had them over," Daniel said, stirring pasta on the stove. "They've been so welcoming since we moved here. We owe them a good meal." Clara's stomach churned. "That's a great idea," she lied, her voice tight. By the time Megan and James arrived, Clara was on edge. She greeted Megan with a hug and forced a smile when she turned to James. His grin was maddeningly calm, as if he reveled in the tension between them. Throughout dinner, Clara felt his gaze linger on her, even as he chatted effortlessly with Daniel. The table buzzed with laughter and conversation, but Clara's focus was divided. Every time she looked at James, she felt trapped in a dangerous game she couldn't escape. After dinner, Megan offered to help with the dishes while Daniel and James stepped outside to admire Daniel's new grill. Clara stayed in the kitchen, scrubbing plates and forcing herself to focus on Megan's chatter. "James mentioned he might take up running again," Megan said, drying a dish. "He's been so busy with work lately, but I think he misses it." Clara nodded, struggling to keep her expression neutral. "That's great. He seems like he'd be good at it." Megan laughed. "Oh, he's always been the athletic one. Me, not so much." The conversation drifted to other topics, but Clara's guilt weighed heavily on her. Megan's kindness only made the betrayal feel sharper, more unforgivable. Later that night, as Clara and Daniel cleaned up, he smiled at her. "That was nice. It's good to have neighbors like them." "Yeah," Clara replied, avoiding his eyes. "They're great." As Daniel headed to bed, Clara lingered in the kitchen, her mind racing. She knew she needed to end whatever was happening with James. But how? The opportunity came the next day when Clara saw James walking his dog. Gathering her courage, she stepped outside to intercept him. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm. James's expression shifted, his usual playful demeanor replaced by something more serious. "All right. Let's walk." They strolled down the quiet street, the tension between them palpable. Clara took a deep breath. "This has to stop," she said. "Whatever this is, it's wrong. Megan and Daniel don't deserve this." James stopped walking, turning to face her. "I know it's wrong, Clara. But I can't stop thinking about you." Clara's heart ached at his words, but she shook her head. "We've already crossed too many lines. It has to end." James nodded reluctantly. "If that's what you want." Clara nodded, grateful and heartbroken at the same time. She turned and walked back toward her house, determined to put an end to the turmoil. For a while, it seemed like things might settle. Clara avoided James and threw herself into repairing her connection with Daniel. She suggested date nights and took more interest in his hobbies, hoping to rebuild the intimacy that had faded. But the past refused to stay buried. One afternoon, Clara was working in the garden when Megan approached, holding her phone with a concerned look. "Clara, can I talk to you for a second?" Megan asked. "Of course," Clara replied, wiping her hands on her jeans. Megan hesitated before showing Clara her phone. On the screen was a series of text messages between James and an unknown number. The messages were flirtatious, suggestive, and unmistakably from Clara. "I found these on James's phone," Megan said, her voice trembling. "Do you know anything about this?" Clara's blood ran cold. She struggled to find her voice. Megan's eyes filled with tears. "Clara, please. Be honest with me." Caught between her guilt and the weight of Megan's anguish, Clara felt her carefully constructed facade begin to crumble. The dangerous game she'd been playing was about to explode, and there was no way to escape the fallout. Megan's tearful gaze pierced Clara to her core. She felt her throat tighten, her mind scrambling for an answer that wouldn't shatter everything. "Megan, I don't know what to say," Clara finally stammered. Those messages, Megan's hands trembled as she held the phone. "Clara, please, just tell me the truth. Did something happen between you and James?" Clara's silence spoke volumes. Megan's face crumpled, and she stepped back as if Clara's proximity burned her. "How could you?" Megan whispered, her voice trembling. "We welcomed you. We trusted you." Clara reached out instinctively. "Megan, I'm so sorry. It wasn't planned. It was a mistake. A horrible, stupid mistake." Megan's anger flared. "A mistake? That's what you call it?" She shook her head, her voice rising. "Does Daniel know?" The question hit like a punch to the gut. Clara's lips parted, but no words came out. Megan's expression shifted, a mixture of fury and disbelief. "He doesn't know, does he?" Megan demanded. "You're walking around like everything's fine while you've been." Her voice broke, and she took a deep, shaky breath. "I can't even look at you right now." Before Clara could respond, Megan turned and walked away, leaving Clara standing in the garden with her heart pounding and her world unraveling. That evening, Clara tried to keep up appearances, but Daniel noticed her unease. "You seem distracted," he said over dinner. "Everything okay?" Clara forced a smile. "Just tired. I spent a lot of time in the garden today." Daniel nodded, accepting her answer, but his concern lingered. Clara excused herself early and retreated to the bedroom, where she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone. The weight of Megan's confrontation pressed heavily on her chest. She knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The following day, Megan's absence was palpable. Usually, Megan would wave or chat with Clara during her morning run, but the street was eerily quiet. Clara's unease grew as hours passed without a sign of her neighbor. By late afternoon, Clara's phone buzzed. It was a text from James. "We need to talk. Now." Clara's heart raced as she read the message. Against her better judgment, she slipped out of the house and walked to James's. He opened the door before she could knock, his expression grim. "Megan knows," James said, his voice low. "She confronted me last night. She found the texts." Clara's stomach churned. "What did you tell her?" "The truth," James admitted. "She didn't give me a choice." Clara felt the floor drop out beneath her. "So she knows everything?" James nodded. "She's furious. And hurt. She said she's going to tell Daniel?" Panic flared in Clara's chest. "No. She can't. It'll ruin everything." "It's already ruined, Clara," James said, his voice sharp. "What did you think was going to happen? That we could keep sneaking around and no one would ever find out?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. I wasn't thinking." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I'll try to talk to Megan. Maybe I can convince her to keep this between us. But you need to prepare for the worst." Clara nodded numbly and left, her mind racing. She felt trapped, the walls of her life closing in. That evening, Megan's absence was replaced by a chilling presence. As Clara prepared dinner, she noticed Megan and James walking down the street toward her house. Panic surged as she saw Megan's determined expression. "Daniel, can you get the door?" Clara called, her voice tight. Moments later, Daniel's confused voice drifted into the kitchen. "Megan? James? What brings you by?" Clara stepped into the living room, her heart pounding. Megan's gaze locked onto hers, cold and unyielding. "We need to talk," Megan said, her voice steely. "All of us." Daniel looked between them, his confusion growing. "What's going on?" Megan took a deep breath. "Clara and James have been having an affair." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. Daniel stared at Megan, then at Clara, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Is this true?" he demanded, his voice low and trembling. Clara opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her silence was all the confirmation Daniel needed. The next moments were a blur of accusations and heartbreak. Daniel's fury erupted, his voice shaking the walls as he demanded answers. Megan stood firm, her own pain evident as she recounted what she'd discovered. James tried to interject, but Daniel turned on him, his fists clenched. "Get out of my house," he growled. "Both of you." James hesitated, but Megan grabbed his arm. "Let's go," she said, her voice tight. They left without another word, leaving Clara and Daniel alone in the wreckage. Daniel stared at Clara, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and anger. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why would you do this to us?" Clara's tears fell freely as she tried to explain. I don't know. I was lost, and it just happened. I'm so sorry, Daniel." "Sorry?" Daniel snapped. "Sorry doesn't fix this. You've destroyed everything we built." Clara could only nod, knowing he was right. The life they built together was crumbling, and there was no going back. The days following the confrontation were a whirlwind of pain and chaos. Daniel moved out of the house, taking only a suitcase and leaving behind a silence that was louder than any argument. Clara was left alone in their once shared home, the emptiness amplifying her guilt and regret. Megan had also thrown James out, and Clara saw him occasionally, walking the neighborhood with a defeated air. Their brief, intense affair had unraveled both families, and now they were left to pick up the pieces, separately. Clara threw herself into trying to mend her marriage. She reached out to Daniel, sending long messages apologizing and begging for another chance. She acknowledged her mistakes, pouring her heart into every word, but his responses were curt and cold. "You broke my trust, Clara. I need time." Each message felt like a small death, but Clara refused to give up. She suggested therapy, both individual and couples, hoping to at least have a conversation. After weeks of persistence, Daniel finally agreed to meet. The therapy sessions were raw and painful. Daniel aired his anger and hurt, while Clara faced the full weight of her actions. "I felt invisible," Clara admitted during one session. Not because of you, but because of how I saw myself. What I did was selfish and wrong, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I just don't know if I can trust you again. Every time I look at you, I see him. The therapist interjected gently. Trust can be rebuilt, but it takes time and effort from both sides. Daniel, what do you need from Clara to begin that process? Daniel hesitated. I need honesty. Complete transparency. No more secrets. Clara nodded fervently. You have my word. I'll do whatever it takes. Meanwhile, Megan's own path was far different. Unlike Daniel, she had no interest in reconciliation. She filed for divorce almost immediately, severing ties with James and beginning the process of rebuilding her life. Clara tried to reach out to her, but Megan ignored every attempt. The friendship that once felt so easy was irreparably broken. James, however, wasn't as willing to let go. He texted Clara sporadically, asking to meet and talk. Clara deleted his messages without replying, determined to put their affair behind her. But one evening, he showed up at her door uninvited. What are you doing here? Clara asked, her voice low and tense. James leaned against the doorframe, his expression conflicted. I just wanted to see you. To talk. There's nothing to talk about, Clara said firmly. We made a mistake, James. A terrible mistake. And I'm trying to fix the damage I've done. Please don't make this harder. James sighed, nodding reluctantly. I'm sorry for everything. I hope you find what you're looking for. With that, he walked away, leaving Clara to close the door on that chapter of her life for good. Months passed, and slowly, Clara and Daniel found small moments of connection. Therapy sessions turned from confrontations into conversations, and shared dinners became less tense. Clara focused on rebuilding Daniel's trust, making sure her actions aligned with her words. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Daniel spoke. I've been thinking, he began. Maybe we could take a trip. Just the two of us. Start fresh. Clara's heart lifted. I'd love that, she said softly. Thank you for giving us another chance. Daniel nodded, his expression still guarded but hopeful. I'm not saying everything's okay, but I think it's worth trying. The trip marked a turning point. Away from the reminders of their past, they rediscovered parts of their relationship that had been buried under years of routine and resentment. They laughed, talked, and began to imagine a future together again. But healing wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments when old wounds reopened and doubts crept in. Yet each time, they chose to face those moments together. A year after the affair came to light, Clara and Daniel stood in their backyard, hosting another barbecue. The atmosphere was different now, smaller, quieter, but filled with genuine warmth. The scars of the past remained, but they were learning to live with them, not be defined by them. Clara glanced at Daniel as he laughed with a neighbor, gratitude swelling in her chest. She knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hope. Sometimes, rebuilding wasn't about forgetting the past but about choosing to move forward despite it. And Clara was ready to keep choosing, every day.